Isn't it a funny paradox that one of the most rigid, humorless monetary systems ever created, the gold standard, was adopted with almost religious passion by governments who thought they'd finally cured economic chaos? Yes, anchoring a nation its entire prosperity too. Shiny rocks, dug from the ground, has always been the peak of rational thinking. Still, the gold standard became a pillar of monetary power, not because it was perfect, but because it offered a comforting illusion. The idea that human weakness could be disciplined by metal. In hindsight, it is almost poetic that global politics and entire governments placed their stability at the mercy of geology. To understand why, you have to appreciate the sheer desperation of 19th century leaders. They genuinely believed that people couldn't be trusted with money unless nature itself set the rules. Gold, in all its glittering simplicity, offered just that. It was finite, heavy, and inconvenient, three qualities that politicians found strangely reassuring. Paper money, on the other hand, was suspiciously lightweight and disturbingly easy to print, and they did print it, sometimes until inflation got so bad that economies fell apart. So, in a moment of monetary self-discipline, governments chained their currencies to gold, trying to save themselves from their own temptations. What could possibly go wrong? The gold standard quickly became a global badge of legitimacy. A country on gold was a country that signaled it was serious, with gold backing the currency. Officials strutted around like strict headmasters. Monetary expansion, only if the bullion allowed. Deficit spending, only if the votes agreed. It's almost endearing how sincerely they thought this system would keep them honest. But beneath this performance of discipline, the gold standard did something much more political. It quietly reshaped how power flowed through global finance. Gold dictated who had authority. Nations with massive reserves strutted across the world stage, while those with little found themselves humiliated and dependent. It was a system that claimed to be neutral but actually created a hierarchy. After all, nothing says fairness like giving more power to the nations lucky enough to sit on large gold deposits. Still, the appeal of gold wasn't just material. It was symbolic. It gave rulers a simple script to follow. Governments could declare their currencies were as good as gold, and the public, conditioned by centuries of myth and glittering treasure, willingly believed them. Gold was eternal. Gold was incorruptible. It didn't lie, cheat, or cave to political pressure. Ironically, this made it the perfect political tool. If a government was struggling, it could just point to the metal and shrugged. The gold made me do it. What a convenient scapegoat. Under this setup, the gold standard became the world's most respectable excuse for austerity. When budgets tightened and poverty rose, authorities would solemnly explain that they had no choice. Gold reserves were low. And who could argue with gold? Not workers, not farmers, not small business owners, crushed by deflation. Gold was the invisible dictator of national policy, and it demanded obedience. But the real genius of the gold standard wasn't its restraint, but how it concentrated power. The countries with steady gold inflows became the aristocrats of international finance. Britain in the 19th century, the United States in the early 20th, these nations wielded monetary influence because their gold reserves gave them disproportionate control. A gold-anchored world meant everyone else had to dance to their tune. The gold standard became a global hierarchy disguised as a fair system. Its defenders draped it in language about sound money and economic integrity. But behind the curtain, this noble rhetoric justified a system where weaker nations suffered painful recessions so strong ones could maintain stability. The political transformation this caused was subtle. States began designing their policies not around what their people needed, but around the sacred duty to defend the currency's gold convertibility. Public welfare often ended up at the bottom of the list. What was tragically comic was that citizens were taught to believe the gold standard protected them. They were told it prevented inflation and guaranteed national strength. And in some ways, it did. But it also engineered severe recessions, prolonged depressions, and paralyzed governments. Right when flexibility was needed most, as countries tightened their belts, political tensions simmered. All the while, gold gleamed silently in vaults, indifferent to the chaos it inspired. When critics suggested that humans should control money instead of letting metal dictate national destiny, they were dismissed as radicals. Yet, Despite its flaws, the gold standard endured for decades because it offered one priceless advantage. It made governments seem trustworthy, even when they weren't. The public felt comforted by the idea that money had value independent of politics. So, the foundation of monetary power under the gold standard was built on a peculiar mix: faith and convenience, fear of inflation. Faith in metal and convenience for those who benefited from the status quo. In the end, the gold standard didn't just shape monetary policy, it shaped political identity. And perhaps the greatest irony is that nations embraced this system to escape chaos, only to find that the real chaos was hiding within the very stability they worshipped. Isn't it one of history's greatest ironies? Gold, an inert metal. It can't think. It can't speak. It has no moral compass, somehow became the ultimate symbol of political legitimacy. While governments lied and economies stumbled, gold just sat silently in vaults. And that silence was taken as honesty. For over a century, the gold standard was the political world's favorite badge of honor, not because governments were suddenly virtuous, but because gold gave them a convenient illusion of virtue. The genius of the gold standard, if you want to call it that, is that it outsourced public trust to geology. Citizens didn't have to believe in their leaders anymore. They just had to believe in gold bars buried somewhere underground. This let governments do pretty much whatever they wanted, as long as they kept up the performance of backing their currency with metal. A country could be corrupt or incompetent, but as long as officials could point to the vault and say their money was as good as gold, everything seemed fine. It was political theater with geological props, and the public bought into it. Gold glitters. It has weight. It feels permanent. Unlike paper money that can be printed on a whim, gold seemed to resist the worst impulses of politicians. That's what people were told. Anyway, gold doesn't rot. It doesn't vanish. By tying their money to gold, societies thought they were anchoring their political systems to something real and eternal. How charmingly naive. This belief turned gold into a powerful political symbol. Leaders climbed onto the gold standard like it was a moral high ground, calling themselves stewards of stability. The message was simple and irresistible. Trust us, because we trust gold. A government could spend recklessly or mishandle a crisis, but still look financially responsible just by keeping that gold peg. The gold standard was like a halo orb, tarnished sometimes, but still radiant. But behind this halo was a more cynical truth. The gold standard gave governments an escape hatch from accountability. When harsh economic measures were needed, they could just blame the gold. Wage cuts? Blame gold. Deflation and mass unemployment? Blame gold. The metal became a scapegoat, an unassailable authority you couldn't argue with. It's not like the average person could march into the central bank and have a debate with a pile of bullion. This was incredibly useful for politicians. Gold was the perfect partner. Silent, obedient, and prestigious. It allowed leaders to disguise their own subjective decisions as the natural consequences of the system. Gold didn't just support the currency, it legitimized the entire power structure. The public, mesmerized by the certainty of metal, accepted policies they would have otherwise rejected. Austerity didn't feel so cruel when it was presented as inevitable. This devotion to gold even influenced international politics. Countries on the gold standard were part of the civilized nations club. Countries off it were seen as irresponsible and untrustworthy. Your monetary policy became a political passport, granting you access to global credit and influence. The system was brilliant at disguising political fights as financial necessities. When governments faced pressure for social reforms they could just say, "Sorry, we can't afford this under gold." It was a polite way to say no without admitting the refusal was a political choice. But ironically, the very system designed to signal stability often did the opposite. The rigid rules of gold made economies brittle. When a crisis hit, governments had their hands tied. They couldn't expand the money supply or run deficits to help people. The same politicians who had boasted about the discipline of gold suddenly found themselves trapped by it. By the early 20th century, the illusion was cracking. World War I forced countries off gold, revealing how fragile the system was. When they tried to go back to it after the war, they found that reality no longer matched their ideology. The resurrected gold standard caused immense suffering, deflation, soaring unemployment, and social unrest. Yet governments clung to it, convinced their legitimacy depended on it. It wasn't until the system totally collapsed in the 1930s that the world finally saw the truth. Suddenly, governments could stimulate their economies and support their citizens since gold had made impossible. Gold's true political role became clear. It wasn't a guarantor of stability. It was a tool to manufacture legitimacy, provide cover for austerity, and create an illusion of order. By imposing limits that society could no longer bear, gold didn't prevent chaos. It just suppressed the symptoms until the whole thing came crashing down, forcing a complete redefinition of money, power, and the state. If you still thought the gold standard was just a monetary system, this is where that charming delusion ends. Because once gold becomes the backbone of a nation's currency, it does something extraordinary not economically, but politically. It rearranges institutions, rewires power, embarrasses leaders, and generally behaves like a glowing, metallic puppeteer. Not bad for a rock you can't even eat. To understand the political transformations ignited by the gold standard, imagine gold as the worst kind of supervisor. Strict, humorless, and allergic to improvisation. Political regimes, on the other hand, are artists of improvisation. They survive on narrative flexibility and spending elasticity. Put these two in the same room, and something has to break. Spoiler alert. It's usually the political system, not the metal. Let's start with a less appreciated truth. A government that adopts the gold standard immediately gives up a chunk of its sovereignty. Not symbolically, not theoretically, practically. Gold sets the rules. Politicians obey. It's one of the few times in history where elected officials are not the adults in the room. They're more like interns, scrambling to meet a deadline set by a quiet, glimmering tyrant in the corner. Gold demands balanced budgets and restrained spending. If government finances spin out of control, say, during a war or a scandal, gold offers zero sympathy. You could scream national emergency on the parliament floor, and the gold standard would just raise an eyebrow and say, "Find the money." This brutal indifference forces governments to operate with the discipline of monks, even when their citizens act more like a circus troupe. And that tension between rigid monetary austerity and chaotic political reality creates the perfect storm for transformation. There's a reason historians sometimes call the gold standard a constitution above the Constitution. It strips governments of the ability to print their way out of mistakes. This is extremely inconvenient for politicians, who historically have relied on money printing the way procrastinators rely on coffee. Once the gold standard is installed, a government has freedom to maneuver shrinks so dramatically that policymakers behave like they re-trapped in a mathematical equation. They must balance, trade, stabilize the currency, and preserve gold reserves all at the same time. In other words, they must perform like competent adults, something political systems rarely excel at. For long, as a result, governments evolve, not voluntarily, but under intense pressure strong enough to fracture parliaments, split parties, and topple cabinets. A nation under the gold standard becomes an ecosystem where only the most financially disciplined and politically stoic factions can survive. The rest, they either adapt or join the growing graveyard of collapsed ministries. One of the most dramatic effects of the gold standard is its uncanny ability to trigger regime change. Throughout history, gold has been the polite executioner of incompetent governments. No riots, no coups, just shrinking gold reserves and dwindling public confidence. And suddenly the prime minister is resigning for personal reasons, which is code for gold killed my career. Consider the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Falling below expected gold reserves wasn't just a financial embarrassment, was political humiliation. A leader could talk about patriotism all day long, but if their nation's gold stock fell, the public saw them as a reckless gambler. Gold is unbiased. It doesn't care if a leader is charismatic or beloved. If they mismanage the economy, the gold standard exposes them with the subtlety of a spotlight at midnight. Governments collapsed this way. Careers that once looked bulletproof dissolved into footnotes, all because gold refuses to lie for anyone. Another interesting side effect is the rise of central banks. When a country ties its currency to gold, It quickly discovers that someone has to guard the vault and keep politicians from making impulsive financial decisions. And politicians are not that someone. So, the gold standard becomes the midwife of stronger central banking institutions. The Bank of England, for example, didn't rise to global importance because Parliament felt generous. It rose because the gold standard forced the government to rely on a technocratic institution that could tell politicians no. The more power central banks get under the gold standard, the more democratic governments start to look like aristocratic financial committees. Influence shifts from elected representatives to unelected monetary custodians. Suddenly, Parliament debates matter less than gold flows. Public opinion matters less than the preferences of international creditors. This is a massive political transformation, where the spotlight drifts from charismatic politicians to stern, silent figures in banking halls. If the gold standard does one thing exceptionally well, it's sorting political factions into clean ideological categories. Nothing clarifies a party's worldview faster than asking, should the currency stay tied to gold even if unemployment doubles? Those who say yes become champions of sound money and fiscal virtue. They see themselves as guardians of discipline. Those who say no are suddenly branded as heretics, accused of supporting inflation and national embarrassment. Political arguments become so intense they border on theological. Gold turns economic debates into moral crusades, where doubting the standard is treated with the same shock as doubting divine scripture in medieval Europe. The consequences: parties split, movements fracture, and the gold standard becomes a catalyst for total political realignment. And this isn't just a domestic affair. If gold transforms internal politics, it electrifies international diplomacy. Countries on the gold standard are like students bound to the same unforgiving exam schedule. One nation devaluing its currency causes a chain reaction, provoking diplomatic tension. So, nations often behave better toward gold than toward each other. When a country abandoned the gold standard, it was seen as a betrayal of the global order. Allies panicked, creditors recoiled, and rivals smirked. Gold didn't just oversee domestic politics. It quietly refereed the entire international system. Perhaps the most fascinating political transformation is the mythology around gold. Governments and intellectuals built narratives about gold's purity, honesty, and gold was portrayed as the ideal citizen, disciplined and morally upright. So, leaders began using gold as a rhetorical prop, promising to govern with the discipline of gold. Political legitimacy became intertwined with the metal. Leaders gained authority by defending it and lost by failing to do so. The metal became a moral measuring stick, and politics reshaped itself around that powerful symbolism. So you think gold is just a shiny rock? Think again. Once you invite gold to the high-stakes table of politics, it never leaves quietly. By the time the classical gold standard was in full swing, gold had transformed from a silent symbol into a relentless taskmaster, dictating terms to governments and central banks alike. If you were looking for monetary freedom, you picked the wrong rock to worship. Under gold, central banks were saddled with a massive burden. They weren't just printing banknotes anymore. They were guardians of national honor, wardens of global credibility. Their main job was to promise that every paper note could, in theory, be exchanged for physical gold. This obligation was a gilded chain, beautiful on the outside, but as constraining as any shackle. Balancing gold reserves wasn't just accounting, it was survival. If a central bank misjudged something, its gold holdings could vanish alarmingly fast. The only real tool they had was the discount rate, which they'd raise to attract foreign gold when reserves got low. There were no helicopter money drops, no print to infinity button. A misstep meant painful deflation, credit freezes, or even a run on the banks. The gold standard didn't just test a central bank's skill, it punished its arrogance. Unsurprisingly, as central banks carried this weight, they became far more powerful than anyone expected. They evolved from technical agencies into bulwarks of state power. A country's ability to defend its currency depended on its gold reserves, so central banks naturally gained political muscle. They became gatekeepers, with the power to veto a government's wild spending sprees. If a government got too ambitious with deficits, the central bank could just raise rates and shut down the party. Gold didn't just demand, discipline it, created a class of unelected, technocrats who were often more powerful than the politicians themselves. Ironically, the very rigidity that made gold seem stable turned it into a lethal weakness during a crisis. When recessions or panics hit, the gold standard's harsh rules showed their flaws. If capital was fleeing the country, a central bank had to raise interest rates to lure gold back. But that cure was often worse than the disease. High rates crushed investment, sapped growth, and led to deflation. The only way to defend the currency was often to choke the economy and let unemployment soar. But here's a funny twist. Gold also forced central banks to talk to each other. Since everyone was desperate to protect their own reserves, they started coordinating on monetary policy. This led to cooperation, but also intense rivalry. Nations began aggressively accumulating gold, turning it into a global power struggle. This wasn't a uniform story. In Latin America, countries adopted gold to seem stable and attract foreign cash. But when the Great Depression hit, they faced a brutal choice. Stick with gold and endure horrific austerity, or abandon it and risk their credibility. Many chose to suffer, at least at first. The eventual collapse of the system there left deep political scars, transforming their central banks from guardians of gold into tools for state-led development. Beyond institutions, gold left a powerful ideological mark. It promoted a worldview that money is finite and discipline is a virtue. Inflation wasn't just an economic problem, it was a moral sin. Central bankers became the high priests of this sound money religion, and politicians who questioned it were branded as heretics. And now for the ultimate irony. When governments finally broke free from gold, they didn't escape constraint, they just changed its form. Central banks gained modern tools like open market operations. But with these tools came huge political risk. So, the very institutions empowered by gold now demanded even more autonomy, arguing that only they could be trusted with the new levers of power. Gold's political legacy wasn't its disappearance. It was the birth of a different kind of monetary control, one driven by expertise, international expectations, and institutional power. The knife edge measured in tons of gold was replaced by a scalpel measured in basis points. In the end, the gold standard wasn't really about gold. It was about how a simple metal forced political systems to bend, transform, and ultimately hand over the keys to a new kind of monetary priesthood. If the gold standard once gripped the world in a rigid metallic vice, its collapse was a drama fit for an ancient tragedy. It had everything: hubris, chaos, finger-pointing, and the triumphant rise of new rulers pretending to be reluctant heroes. Gold didn't just retire quietly. It was dragged off stage by the very governments who had sworn unwavering loyalty to it. And in a grand, satirical twist, this liberation didn't lead to monetary freedom. Instead, it delivered nations into a fresh labyrinth of illusions, rules, and technocratic power cloaked in the language of modernity. The gold standard didn't collapse with one big explosion. It began to rot from within. By the early 20th century, a simple truth became undeniable. The system was incompatible with reality. Wars grew too large, debts too heavy, and economies too complex for a system designed for a simpler time. Yet politicians defended gold with a loyalty bordering on the absurd. For decades, governments forced themselves into gold's tightening corset. They slashed spending, raised interest rates, and squeezed their citizens, declaring austerity a virtue. They even blamed the public for wanting jobs and food, as if these basic human needs threatened the sacred balance of bullion. And then, predictably, everything broke. The first major cracks appeared during World War I. Nations needed to spend money at a pace no gold reserve could justify. So, they temporarily suspended convertibility, promising it was just for the war, promising a return to discipline. They lied. After the war, they scrambled to restore the gold standard, not because it made sense, but because they couldn't admit it was obsolete. The result: misery, depression, and social upheaval. Yet gold, the unforgiving master, demanded one more sacrifice. It was during the Great Depression that gold revealed its true nature. Not a stabilizer, but a merciless executioner. As the global economy imploded, central banks hesitated to expand credit or support their banks, not because they didn't know how, but because they lacked gold. The system forbade mercy. Nations strangled their own economies, Desperate to defend their currency's parity, deflation spiraled, banks failed, and unemployment soared. Still, governments insisted gold was innocent. Only when political structures began to crack, when mass unemployment threatened revolution, did leaders finally entertain the unthinkable. Maybe gold was the problem, not the cure. Once that idea took hold, gold's aura shattered. Politicians wasted no time rewriting the narrative. They weren't failing. They were modernizing monetary policy. They weren't surrendering discipline. They were prioritizing national stability. One by one, nations unhitched their currencies from gold and pretended it was their idea all along. Suddenly, governments felt an intoxicating freedom. They could run deficits, estimulat economies, and build vast welfare states with money created by decree, not by geology. They declared victory. But freedom always demands a custodian. Into this void stepped a new class of monarchs. Central bankers, armed not with gold bars, but with levers, models, and complex jargon. They made ordinary citizens feel too unsophisticated to question monetary policy. Under gold, central banks were guardians. Under fiat currency, they became architects. They promoted themselves as humble technicians, even as they acquired power comparable to government ministers, with far less accountability. In this post-gold world, credibility replaced convertibility. You could trust a currency only if you trusted the people running the show. Central banks invented new rituals to simulate discipline. Inflation targets, fiscal rules, and promises of independence. Fiat currency didn't abolish constraints. It replaced physical constraints with psychological ones. Gold demanded obedience through weight. Fiat demanded it through reputation. The end of gold also reshaped global power. The United States, with its deep financial markets and political influence, rose to undisputed dominance. Dollar hegemony wasn't an accident. It was the natural consequence of a world where trust replaced metal, and America could manufacture more trust than anyone. For other countries, it was a different story. Their currencies were tossed on waves of speculation and investor mood, leading to decades of instability. The final irony is this. Liberated from gold, governments built systems so complex that even they no longer fully understood them. The monetary world became a sprawling network of derivatives, shadow banking, and algorithmic markets. Gold had constrained nations through rigidity. Its successors constrained them through complexity. In a way, the gold standard didn't die. It evolved from a physical rule into a metaphysical one, a belief that our money must be anchored by something, even if that something is just a story. The collapse of gold wasn't just a monetary event. It was a political transformation that engineered an entire era, one that continues long after the last currency was pried from its grip.